Who doesn't love a good redemption story? And indeed, that's what we have with No Man's Sky. A game that when it initially launched was actually blasted due to not living up to the enormous amount of hype that preceded it, but now in 2019 it's a game that people will lord over. Something that has improved with completely free updates and is now actually exceeding its original vision, which is something that I think Hello Games should be highly commended for. However, it does reinforce a pattern I am beginning to notice in gaming that perhaps isn't something we want to encourage. So while again I will reiterate that Hello Games should be commended for really improving this game, when to be fair they really didn't have to. They just wanted to, I suppose, prove everyone wrong and show that they could create something close to that original vision. But it does mean that we enter a world where the game that releases is not necessarily the game we end up with. And that creates an unfortunate dynamic for the consumer where a precedent is set where we are expected to buy the game or even pre-order the game knowing that the game we will get is not necessarily what we want, but the caveat comes with the promise that it might get better later. And with something like No Man's Sky, that's brilliant. It did get better later. So if I bought the game back in 2016, which I did, and I'm playing it now, I am enjoying it, that's fantastic. But this is, I would say, an exception rather than the rule. I think this comes as a result of Hello Games being very passionate developers who, I think it's fair to say, Sony oversold the game. They put a lot of marketing behind it and just want to regain their reputation. It's a unique case of a relatively small group of people wanting to restore their honour, if you will, in the eyes of gamers. Because what they've created here is clearly something born of passion. It's something unique, it's not derivative, and it's incredibly ambitious, perhaps overly ambitious for a team of the size that created it. But they've done a fantastic job. But a lot of the time what happens is a game will come out and it will be in a very rushed state. And there will be a promise that things will get better, but that's not always the case. And so we end up as consumers rolling the dice somewhat as to whether or not the developers will have the funding to continue to support the game. So I'll give an example of a game. Maybe it's a little unfair to judge it so early, but I'm going to do it anyway. Something like Anthem, a game that when it came out was promised to have this strong roadmap of additional content that will be provided for free. However, now what we're seeing is that key leaders in the development team are leaving and that the content being released is incredibly lackluster. All of this on top of the fact that the game itself did not live up to expectations. Another side, another way of looking at this dynamic, something like Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. Now this is a game that came out in a good state, something that people really enjoyed and really liked, and got rave reviews as a result. But then, just a month and a bit after it came out, we end up with microtransactions in the game. And there's a debate as to the degree of the microtransactions, but what it is fair to say is that a significant portion of the people who bought that game are no longer happy. That is factual. And that creates a dynamic where the game released in a good state but got worse. So it's the reverse of what we have with No Man's Sky. Something that you've bought into under the pretense that it's providing a certain experience with a quarantine around maybe practices that you don't agree with, but then they were removed after launch. And the same thing happened, as I keep saying and will keep saying, with Black Ops 4 as well. So the game we get on launch, the game that is reviewed, and that review score will remain in most cases as it is upon review, because critics don't usually go back and re-review a game. Not unheard of, but it's not the norm. But the game you start with is not the game you end with. And is that something we want going forward? I love redemption stories, yes, like No Man's Sky, but I prefer it when we have games like this. At random, choose something like God of War, one of, I think, the best games of all time, and I do not use hyperbole in that. certainly the best game of last year. A game that released with a complete experience by any stretch of the imagination, any measurement. A game that you bought, you were satisfied with, and lived up to the hype and the expectation. In fact, vastly exceeded it in my opinion. And it's not a game that is being tinkered with or worsened or made up for post-launch. It is a game that came out and you got what you paid for, and as a result won many accolades. And I wish that gaming was more like that more often. I appreciate God of War is a little bit exceptional in that not every game can have that budget. But I wish more games would be like they were in the era of the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube, where the game had to be right. It had to be done. It had to be in its final state when it was released, because you couldn't update it. You couldn't change the game after it came out. So it forced developers to put a game out when it was ready. Okay, maybe I'm overly romanticising that. We got games that were unfinished and buggy, but it did at least create an incentive there to not have a day one patch to get rid of some of the final bugs. It meant that the game had to be done before it shipped. And now we are in a world where you can put out a game in any state, because there's always the potential, the promise that you will improve it later on. And when that happens, it's great. I'm all for that. But you're rolling the dice as a consumer as to whether or not that will happen. So to finish this video, to conclude here, I would like to again reiterate that Hello Games have done a fantastic job with No Man's Sky, and I've decided to dive back in myself. I've started a completely new run of the game and I'm really enjoying it. They cannot be commended enough for that job. However, the overall precedent that it sets, along with the other games I've mentioned here, is not something that I think is particularly healthy, because all it takes is a more nefariously minded publisher to misuse this concept of releasing and then improving it to the state it was originally promised. So, as always people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.